Today's episode is sponsored by the free-to-play game War Thunder, which I will use to give you some visual examples of how Germany used some of their late-war tank-busting rockets during World War II. If you are like me and into planes, or perhaps you prefer puny targets like tanks or ships, War Thunder's wide selection of vehicles has everything you want. Get started with War Thunder by using the link in the description below to sign up for free and receive a sign-up bonus. More information on War Thunder and your bonus later on in the video. Hello everybody, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I have two pieces of good news for you. First of all, I have another file here from the German Military Archive about a topic that I think a lot of you find quite fascinating, and that is of course Luftwaffe anti-tank operations, especially on the Eastern Front during World War II. And the second good piece of news is my plant is recovering. A lot of you guys were concerned apparently that this plant wasn't doing all too well. Yes, I was watering it. It's just been repotted, so it took some time to acclimatize to the new earth, except this delinquent. For the file that I'm going to talk about so in the last episode, you might remember we had some examples about early tank busting on the Eastern Front. So we're talking about around about 1942, 1943, with especially the Henschel's 129 and so on and so forth. We looked at the MK101, which was an early tank busting cannon, and also sort of the progression into the MK103. Now today we're going to do something slightly different, because we're going to look at the end of the war, around about end of 1944 and then of course early 1945, because the Germans actually transitioned away from cannons towards rockets. Now, of course, nowadays the Henschel 129 and the Junkers 87 in their anti-tank role, they're quite popular, and we often talk about them. But if you actually look at the grand total of Luftwaffe operations on the Eastern Front, I would actually argue that the Zerstörergeschwader delivering close air support, and also the Schlachtgeschwader, especially the Schlachtgeschwader, starting around about mid-1943, become a lot more important, because it is them that are targeting motorized column supply coming towards the front lines, the Soviet front lines of course, and trying to stem the tide that way. And one of the planes that is of course important in that role is the FW-190, the Focke-Wulf 190, which starts out as a fighter but then becomes a fighter bomber. The Focke-Wulf 190, it is fast, it can double as a fighter, it can defend itself, and it has a similar bomb load to a Ju-87, and as well as that, it can be stationed closer to the front lines, and this is really a big difference, it can find its targets independently. And we see in quite a lot of Luftwaffe reports how they're saying that, well, our Stukas, they're accurate, yes, but if they're coming in at 4,000, 5,000 meters to set up that dive, they're really not going to be able to see the targets just in the same way as a Schlachtflieger would, Focke-Wulf 190, because that aircraft flies at lower altitude and is more flexible and able to independently spot targets and also react to the movements on the ground. A Stuka really is more designed for a point target. And that is really sort of the big difference there between those two aircraft that we don't actually talk about that much, but operationally that's really crucial. Now, even though I've just talked about the bomb load of the 190, which is similar to that of the Ju-87, today I want to talk specifically about rockets and not bombs, and also not cannons in an anti-tank role, because, well, the Germans realized that cannons have some distinct disadvantages in an anti-tank role as well, and that rockets could provide an answer to these. So to start this out, let's look at the difference between cannons and rockets. For aircraft armament, larger calibers quickly run into limits due to the weight of the weapon, recoil and barrel length. Due to this, an attempt is made to use rockets that have lighter mountings with larger calibers and an increased effect. Maintenance difficulties are lower than with the common anti-tank cannon armament. Although the Henschel 129 and Junkers 87 are mentioned here, these aircraft continue to use this armament as rockets, but generally limited to the Focke-Wulf FW-190. To summarize, a caliber of 30 to 37 mm in the BK-37 Bordkanone 37 was the limit of what was feasible for a plane to carry. The experiments the Luftwaffe did with larger calibers like the 75 mm pack gun failed, big time. The successive recoil of these weapons would break the aircraft. This limited the destructive potential of the guns that could actually be used, since they were limited to smaller calibers. As well as that, as noted, the turnaround time and maintenance was greatly reduced by using rockets instead of cannons. Additionally, rockets had other properties, both from a manufacturing and combat perspective. For the manufacturing side, rockets were cheaper to manufacture and used fewer precious resources. They were simpler to manufacture as well, requiring less skilled labor, and could be constructed in very simple facilities. And both of these factors are crucial. Not only does Germany begin to lose access to various resources and facilities, but remember that the Luftwaffe by the end of the war was the single greatest user of untrained slave labor in the Wehrmacht, having started to indiscriminately use concentration camp victims and forced foreign labor from very early on. As for the combat properties, depending on the device used, rockets could sometimes cause less performance loss compared to gun pods. And the destructive capability of a single rocket hit was deemed higher than that of a cannon hit, and the improved turnaround time and less maintenance obviously had advantages as well. And depending on the type of rocket warhead, there would also be a suppression effect and shrapnel, endangering nearby men and material around the tanks. Now, rockets had disadvantages as well. They were generally less accurate, but as we will see, for some planes, this still might have been a better choice. Now, that was a little bit of a generic overview of the advantages that rockets have over cannons, but it's very important also to look at the technical side of things. With the FW-190, we actually do have a test where the Germans try to strap a single MK-103 below each wing for a grand total of 2 MK-103s. That's a 30mm anti-tank cannon that the German Luftwaffe used, and to see whether this cannon would work on the aircraft. And they did some firing trials on the ground and in the air, and these were the results. On the ground, the dispersion of the weapon was unacceptable. With 11 shot salvos at 100 meters, it was roughly 1.5 by 1.5 meters. To improve this, they were synchronized electronically and the dispersion was reduced to 80 by 80 centimeters. However, this resulted in priming failures. The reason for this could not be identified, and as such the cannons reverted back to asynchronized fire. In the air, this had an extremely bad result, as on average 2 to 4 hits were scored with 58 shots at a target of 4 by 4 meters. This extremely low hit count cannot just be traced back to the large dispersion, but also due to the aircraft's nose being pushed downwards during fire, as the considerable recoil was located far below the center of gravity. Due to this, it is not surprising that the FW-190, which generally used bombs to combat ground units, was the primary recipient of rockets against tanks, as the Henschel 129 and Junkers 87 would stick to their cannons. Now, there were 4 primary rocket systems that the Luftwaffe developed and tried to use against ground targets. Those were the Panzerschreck, you might know that one, the M8 and the Panzerblitz. And then of course you also have the Werfergranate 21, which was also mainly used in an air-to-air role, but sometimes could also be used against ground targets. But I'm not going to be talking about that rocket here because it wasn't really meant to be used against tanks. Now we're going to go through this one by one, and we're going to start with the Panzerschreck. So the Luftwaffe Panzerschreck is not much different to the Army's, the Heer's Panzerschreck. It is based on that man-portable anti-tank weapon that a soldier could use in the field, and the Luftwaffe took a few of those, strapped them onto the wings of a Focke-Wulf 190 and called it an anti-tank weapon for themselves. And I don't think, given that makeshift arrangement, you will be surprised if I tell you that the Luftwaffe also designated this as a Sofortlösung, an immediate solution to the problem that they were facing. Now, the Panzerschreck is capable of penetrating round about 160 millimeters of steel set at 60 degrees. Now, those are German degrees, by the way, German 60 degrees. For the English and the Americans, the corresponding angle would be 30 degrees. It's the same angle, essentially just counted from the other side. That's just how it was done back then. Now, Let me try that sentence again. The classification of this weapon as a Sofortlösung, that really gives you an idea of what is really going on here. This is an interim solution that they're just pushing out in order to have something done and ready that they can use, and then later on the line they can come up with more sophisticated rockets, right? But one report here that I have from August 1944 gives us a couple of notices on this. As to provide an immediate solution for the FW-190s for combating tanks, the Panzerschreck of the Heer constitutes minimal effort, and as such the main attention lies with this piece of equipment. The use of the Heer's close combat weapon Panzerschreck to combat enemy tanks with the FW-190 appears to promise success after preliminary firing trials. This immediate solution of the tank kill problem with the FW-190 in the east is underlined by the limited investment required. So based on what I can find, the Focke-Wulf 190 would be using 12 Panzerschrecks, 6 under each wings, firing in salvos of 6. So that would be starting from the outer side, going towards the inner, 3, 3, just like so. To test this weapon, an old French tank was used. This is identified in the file as Französischer Panzerkampfwagen Baumuster Renault. Since I don't know further details about this tank, this could either be a newer version of the older Renault FT, or the R35, or perhaps the Werra R40. In size they are roughly equal though, so this is just academic at this point. With 147 rockets fired, 19 hits were registered, that's 13%, of which 10 were considered to inflict enough damage to actually destroy the tanks. Killing blows, that's 7% there. Mind you, this is already quite a high number, but I found another file that indicated a 40% hit ratio made during the test at the same Erprobungskommando on the same tank. But since there's no additional information about this alleged 40% hit ratio, I would take that with a massive chunk of salt. Dispersion, the Panzerschreck on average. The results show that the horizontal dispersion, which has a significant influence on the hit chances on a tank, is acceptable, although the used firing racks still don't have the accuracy that would be required in series production. Now, I think this is an excellent moment then to talk about rocket accuracy, because while rockets, when they hit, have a greater one-hit kill potential than cannons, they are also way less accurate. Yeah, and a specialized anti-tank cannon like the MK103 or the BK-37 was quite accurate. Rockets less so, and that across nations. For example, we can take the results of a British test here as a comparison. The British once captured a Panther tank and they painted it white, put it in an open field. It was a very obvious target, and then they had a couple of Typhoons unload a whole storehouse worth of 3-inch rockets on it. And let me just pull up the figures here. Yeah, so out of 64 rockets fired, they fired from a distance of 750 to 900 meters. They hit 3 times. That's a 4% hit ratio. Now, 2 out of those 3 hits were classified as killing blows, which is actually quite a good result. But if we look at the German hit ratios, at least during that test that they conducted against the French tank, they do come up with slightly better figures, don't they, with their test of the Panzerschreck, although I would caution you to take those figures with a little bit of salt, because we don't know exactly the methodology behind it, and given the disadvantages of the Panzerschreck as an aerial delivered weapon, and we're going to talk about those in just a second, I feel like hitting a target the size of a small French tank compared to what the Brits had to do with the Panther tank, which is a much larger tank, and then the Germans get a better hit ratio than the Brits, that seems a little bit strange. But let's talk about these disadvantages that the Panzerschreck has. One of the main disadvantages of the Panzerschreck was that it had been designed for use on the ground. As such, its velocity and stability at range was limited. At 110 meters per second from a stationary firing point, the weapon did not have the best characteristics for aircraft use, thus also requiring that 300-meter engagement range, which was quite close. This had some disadvantages attached to it, as the closer engagement range also means that the pilot has to fly in a more predictable manner, close to the ground for a longer time, putting him and the plane at greater risk from ground fire. Compared, for example, with the British 3-inch rocket and the later German rocket, this was a serious disadvantage of the Panzerschreck if fired from the air. However, as a Sofortlösung, an immediate solution, the Panzerschreck was quickly adopted. Development and testing completed. The first Staffeln are being re-equipped and retrained at Ubert. The first Staffeln is on its way into action. Until the end of September, the first deliveries are to be completed. 10,000 shots have been secured for the first operational use from the Oberkommando des Heeres. Now let's move on to the M8, but this should not be confused with the American M8 4.5-inch rocket. It's a completely different system, but don't worry, that's not the only confusing point. Now the first thing that we have to say about this weapon is that it was initially it was an SS development, which the Luftwaffe then took over. Now I have to admit that I know very little about this rocket's development, initial development with the SS, where it was conducted, how it was conducted. So if I miss something here, please bear with me. However, this weapon, strangely for an anti-tank weapon, the way the Luftwaffe used it, initially only had an HE and high explosive warhead. And this was meant, the initial idea here was to use this rocket against landing ships and transporters rather than tanks. Of course, it can also then be used against ground targets, soft targets, but in order to get that armor penetrating capability, a new warhead is needed. Now, the main advantage of the M8 über the, I'm starting to talk German here, the main advantage of the M8 over the Panzerschreck was that it was, of course, from the get-go envisioned to be used as an air-delivered weapon. And for example, the propellant charge was a lot more powerful than that of the Panzerschreck. The continuation of the M8 projectiles of the SS on a mock-up ship resulted in sufficient hit prospects from a distance of 1,000 meters. The average horizontal dispersion was only 5 meters. As such, the hit probability of the M8 with a correct approach from 1000 meters is roughly the same as that of the Panzerschreck from 300 meters. However, although there was a lot of optimism early on with the M8, this suffered a blow later on because the Germans then downsized the target that they fired as rockets at from a ship to a locomotive. Now, a locomotive is still a large target, but they've realized that the hit ratio, the hit accuracy here is a lot lower. Now I have the figures here. There were 18 attacks flown with 8 rockets each, so in total 144 rockets should have been fired. That's going to be important very soon. And between those rockets that were fired, only 4 hits were counted. Now in grand total, that's a hit ratio of 2.5%, which is very similar to what the British were experiencing with their 3-inch rockets, which is, I think, quite a... Now, I hesitate to call this a bad result. That is just the result you're going to get with these sort of rockets at this sort of time. What is bad, however, is that each plane loaded up with each time with 8 rockets suffered about 2 to 3 failures to fire. So more than 25% sometimes of the ordnance never went down range, and that in fact is a really bad result. This means that the weapon initially, although a lot of optimism was placed on it, it wasn't described as useful as anticipated, but it does provide the basis for further development, and this is when we come to the Panzerblitz. So the Panzerblitz, which I have to say, that name Panzerblitz, yeah, you take the German word of Panzer, you take the German word of Blitz, lightning, and Blitzkrieg, and you put them together, Panzerblitz. It's a word that sells itself. I'm actually surprised there aren't like 20,000 books written, the Panzerblitz, you know. I'm really surprised. Maybe it's because this weapon isn't that well known, but that being set aside, talking about the literature actually, in the literature, as well as in primary sources, the terminology between M8 and Panzerblitz is sometimes fluid, and it seems to me that sometimes they're used interchangeably and sometimes not, which makes it a little bit hard retroactively in 2021 to figure out what exact weapon they are talking about in the document. But let's talk about the Panzerblitz for now, and I'm going to pick up on the M8 again in a little while. This was the most promising development that the Luftwaffe had in 1944 when it comes to an anti-tank rocket. Panzerblitz. This rocket is composed out of the propellant chamber of the M8, caliber 8 cm, and the Puppenkopf of the Panzerschreck, caliber 8.8 cm. Development and testing to be completed by the 10th October 1944. Until the 15th October 1944, the first 20,000 shots are to be delivered to their air units. Due to sharing the same warhead, the Panzerblitz had a similar penetration to the Panzerschreck, and an indicated velocity of 410 meters per second from a stationary position gave it some better properties, although I also have data suggesting it was actually lower. Nevertheless, it is between 3 to 4 times as much as the Panzerschreck. This allowed firing distances to increase from 300 to 800 meters, which was a lot better. Although there is generally little information, the Panzerblitz was slotted to be improved into the Panzerblitz 2 and Panzerblitz 3 and even 4. To give you a better idea of this rocket as a whole and a visual representation, I'm going to use some footage here provided by War Thunder. Between the different versions of Panzerblitz, all three were still installed on rails. The Panzerblitz 2 had some of the most crucial changes, most notably having the propellant chamber also changed and being now based on the 5.5 cm R4M rocket, an air-to-air rocket. This made it smaller, in theory allowing for more rockets to be carried. But since the warhead was actually still the same size, the benefit seems to have been minor. However, its velocity still appears to have been too low, apparently leading to its cancellation and kickstarting development of the Panzerblitz 3 and 4, meant to improve velocity beyond 500 meters per second. This remained a paper project. Hermann notes that the Panzerblitz 3 had an anticipated penetration of 80 millimeters, which is about half of that of the Panzerblitz 1, indicating the use of a new warhead. The Panzerblitz is indicated to have also been tested with 4 strapped to each wing, firing in 2 salvos of 4. Later on, it was increased to the same number of rockets as with the Panzerschreck, 6 per wing, set on rails. The Panzerblitz was the definitive air-to-ground anti-tank rocket Germany produced during World War II. It combined the more advantageous properties of the propellant chamber of the M8 over the Panzerschreck with the armor-piercing capability of the Panzerschreck. However, it was still interchangeable with the M8 high-explosive warhead as well. This means that, depending on the mission, different warheads can be used. For ships or troops, the original warhead of the Panzerblitz. To combat tanks, the Puppenkopf of the Panzerschreck. So that also gives you one of the reasons why it seems that these words M8 and Panzerblitz were sometimes used interchangeably, because really what changes is the warhead. Now, operational use of this weapon is a little bit hard to track down because, of course, at the end of the war, record keeping was no longer the highest priority, let's say, and also a lot was lost just in the final months of the war. A lot of documents just disappeared, went up in flames, just never seen again, right? But I did find an experience report from the Schlachtgeschwader 4 from November 1944, and Schlachtgeschwader 4 had at least one Gruppe which was in a dedicated anti-tank role, which received dedicated anti-tank training with these rockets. And in this report they state that Panzerblitz may only be used against tanks that have broken through, because the approach is done at 30 meters of altitude. Over enemy territory, this altitude would result in the sure loss of the aircraft before an effective attack can be made. Now this correlates very much with the sort of general tactics and operational use of these Panzerjägerstaffeln that the Luftwaffe has. They would always focus on broken through tanks, Soviet armor that had punched through the German lines, rather than trying to find them directly on the front line or in the Soviet hinterland. They didn't have time for that. Now, an interesting side note, based on the preliminary research that I've done, is that the M8, so the rocket with the HE warhead, was mainly used on the Western Front against, American, Canadian, French, British, Scottish troops, whereas the Panzerblitz was mainly used in the East. And this might show you sort of the importance of, first of all, defeating Soviet armor in the East, but also in the West, that tanks weren't that much of an issue perhaps, or weren't that high of a priority, and that it was more about destroying soft targets like truck convoys, mechanized columns, supply runs or something like that. And now, before we move on to a very quick intermission. Yes, it is that time again, but don't worry, the pain will end soon. Consider, if you like this content, to do the whole YouTube combo jumbo thing with subscribing, notification bell, liking. What else is there? Commenting, of course, yes. Yes, of course it is in my interest to remind you to do that, but let's be honest, that also means that YouTube understands that you like this content, so next time a video comes out, you will get notified by YouTube, and it's a win-win situation because I get to do this and you get free regular content on military aviation. So both of us are winner, so let's win-win together. And now back to the video. At this point, what you probably want to know is how many of these rockets, how many of these Panzerblitzes were used at the end of the war. And it seems like production of these weapons really skyrocketed in the last couple of months of the war. Based on some of the operational data I have also from the German Luftwaffe Staffeln, I can show you a quick breakdown here of the operational use as well. For the Panzerschreck, I have numbers on the 4. Staffel Schlachtgeschwader 3, 5. Staffel Schlachtgeschwader 77 and 8. Staffel Schlachtgeschwader 1. This is on the Eastern Front, by the way. I'll indicate the date range for the data here. Together, they fired close to 1,000 Panzerschrecks in 84 sorties. They claim to have scored the following success: 26 tanks destroyed, 8 damaged, 25 trucks destroyed. Interesting here is the number of fired shots to the assumed number of shots carried, indicating a failure rate of roughly 4.3%. For the Panzerblitz, I have the combined figures of 7., 8. and 9. Staffel of Schlachtgeschwader 4 and the data for the 13. Panzerjäger Staffel Schlachtgeschwader 151. Again, the date range is indicated. Based on the number of sorties and Panzerblitze fired, there's something strange here. It looks like at least some of these missions were either flown with 12 or 8 rockets, and that maybe the values once again indicate a failure rate, but this is quite high at 18%. Again, I can only speculate how these figures came about. Maybe this is a combination of failure rates, operational losses, and different loadouts between the aircraft. Anyway, together 20 tanks were claimed as destroyed, 28 damaged, and 36 trucks destroyed. As you can see, the ratio of per destroyed tank is much higher. Then again, I wouldn't put too much stock in these ratio numbers just on face value, since kill claims are notoriously hard to verify. Here, the number given to you is a general indicator of the perceived effectiveness of this weapon, together with usable information on their operational use. To drive this point home, that kill claims are only an approximate estimate at best, let us look at another statistic from Luftwaffenkommando 6 these Staffels were attached to. Between the 16th to the 20th of February 1945, roughly 2,100 Schlachtflieger sorties, of which 300 dedicated Panzerjäger sorties were flown in either Focke-Wulf 190s or with a very small number of Henschel 129s and Junker 87s. 103 tanks were claimed as destroyed and 45 damaged. Over 360 vehicles were claimed destroyed and 110 damaged. However, Luftwaffenkommando 6 as a whole claimed the following success: 1,050 destroyed tanks. What the? The figures by the flag are included, by the way, and shown here in brackets. And additionally to these alleged 1,050 destroyed tanks, Luftwaffenkommando 6 also claimed 430 damaged tanks, as well as 7,000 destroyed vehicles and 2,500 damaged vehicles. Alright, so I'm going to be completely honest here as I'm completing the video. I don't know exactly where the Germans are getting their information from in order to arrive at a grand total of 1,050 kills between the 12th of January and the 19th of February 1945. This is going to be a limitation of this video. I simply do not have that data, I simply do not have that information, and I can only make assumptions and a couple of hypotheses perhaps. But what I would like to mention are a couple of things here. First of all, don't take the number of 1,050 just at the number. Think about it, what it means for the Soviets. Because 1,050 tanks, if we look at tank brigades in the Soviet army equipped with T-34s, means essentially 16 tank brigades destroyed. 16, 1-6. Which is a lot if you come to think about it that way. And at the same time, of course, these kill claims, of course, we have to be a a little bit skeptical from the onset, because we know from World War II how effective rockets were against tanks when you really hammer down into the data and when you have some really solid correlations between the actually supposedly destroyed tanks and the number of sorties flown against them. For example, on the Western Front, we have a very good report by the RAF and the United States Army Air Force on this, and it is nowhere close to this figure, nowhere close to this figure. You can read about it in Ian Gunderson's book. I also have it in the sources down below. But one of the things that I've noticed, which is me going out on a limb, I'm going to say this is me speculating, so please don't quote me on this and please don't take this as verbatim fact. It certainly isn't. But look at the amount of kills that Schlachtgeschwader 2, 9 and 77 have in 5 days. And that is 103. This is claim kills once again. But in 5 days, that essentially is an average of 20 kills a day. Now look at the figure down low for Luftwaffe 6 for a period of 38 days. If you subtract the amount of flak kills, you get 740. Now if you take the average of the first average of 20 tank kills a day and you multiply that by a period of 38 days, or actually 37 days, depending on how you want to count your days, you're getting very close or exactly the figure that we're talking about. So is this Luftwaffe 6 using just a general average of 20 kills a day for tanks in their calculation? I don't know. This really is speculation. This might just be a random coincidence. It really might just be a coincidence. But sometimes coincidences point you into the proper direction. Now, of course, if we're going to look at World War II and kill claims, we're never going to be working with a figure that is going to be 100% accurate all the times. In fact, it's going to be the complete opposite. Most of the time, they're completely wrong. But if you want to have some certainty in your life, and if you want to make sure that if you kill a tank, then you also get that noted in your statistics, make sure to check out today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder features more than 1,700 aircraft, helicopters, tanks, and ships, and allows you to take part in exciting and explosive virtual battles. Here, when you kill an enemy tank, you will get the kill credited properly, and if you don't make the kill, then one of your battle buddies does. What I really enjoy in War Thunder is their mixed battle experience, where I can drive around in a tank, and currently I especially enjoy the Swedish and French vehicles in the game, and then of course fly a plane and go tank hunting. And again, with proper kill claims. War Thunder adds new tanks, ships, and of course aircraft in continuous updates, and the game features full cross-platform integration between PC, PlayStation and Xbox. So sign up for free by following the link in the description below and receive a special sign-up bonus for 3 days of premium and an exclusive sign-up bonus vehicle of your choice. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comment section down below what you thought about this topic, about the data that I shared with you. If you have something to add, if you have something to share, looking forward to your feedback and your comments. Now remember, there's a new video on my channel on every Thursday of every month, except of every month. Yes, there's a couple of Thursdays in a month, but every Thursday there is going to be a video except the first Thursday of every month, because that's my off week. So remember, Thursday is MAD, Military Aviation History Day. It's supposed to sound catchy. It doesn't really sound catchy, but we're embracing it now, aren't we? Yes. Upcoming content. What do I have? Yes, there's going to be an episode on the Brewster Buffalo. I'm really looking forward to that one. There's going to be a fantastic expert interview on the current strengths and weaknesses of the Russian Air Force. And I'm also conducting a lot of research currently on the Luftwaffe reception, not really the reception, the Luftwaffe response to the Dieppe raid. I'm doing a lot of research there at the moment. That video is just starting to balloon, so I'm gonna have to see what I do with that, but it's going to be absolutely fantastic. I'm learning so much stuff myself. So yeah, I hope that all of you have a fantastic day. If you want to have regular updates, also make sure that you follow on Facebook, on Twitter, on instant gratification. And as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.